Here's a fun question for you. Imagine you're standing by a train track and you see a runaway train barreling toward 5 people who are tied to the rails. You're next to a lever that can switch the train to another track, but there's a catch. On that other track, there's one person tied down. If you pull the lever, you'll save 5 lives, but you'll kill one person in the process. If you do nothing, 5 people die, but you won't be directly responsible. What would you do? Would you kill one person to save 5? Of course, this is the popular trolley problem that we heard thousands of times. Most philosophers say there isn't an objectively right or wrong solution to these trolley problems. But let me introduce to a theory that not only says that you should pull the lever, it in fact says you're morally obligated to do it. It's called utilitarianism, and if your lawyer is a utilitarian, you might just be able to get away with murder and many unspeakable crimes. Before you start thinking this is some kind of villainous philosophy cooked up by comic book masterminds, you should know that utilitarianism is actually one of the most influential moral theories in history. It shapes how governments make policies, how doctors make life and death decisions, and how economists think about society. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The same logic that tells us to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people can also be twisted to justify things most of us would consider deeply wrong. So let's dig into this theory, understand why it's so powerful, and figure out where it all goes terribly wrong. Utilitarianism emerged during the Enlightenment, that period in the 18th and 19th centuries when thinkers were challenging everything. They were done with moral rules handed down by kings and priests. They wanted a morality based on reason, one that anyone could understand and apply. The core idea was simple and kind of beautiful in its own way. Morality should aim to make life better for everyone by increasing happiness and decreasing suffering. Instead of following ancient commandments or religious traditions just because someone said so, utilitarians believe we should focus on outcome. Does an action make the world a better place? Does it reduce pain and increase pleasure? If yes, then it's the right thing to do. If not, it's wrong. This is what they call the principle of utility, and it can be summed up in one famous phrase. An action is right if it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The two founding fathers of utilitarianism were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. These weren't just philosophers sitting in ivory towers, they were social reformers who wanted to change the world. Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832, believed society was full of unnecessary cruelty and outdated laws that caused suffering for no good reason. He wanted a clear, logical system that anyone could use to determine what was right and wrong. Mill, who came a generation later, refined Bentham's ideas and tried to make utilitarianism more sophisticated and humane. Together, they created a moral theory that would influence not just philosophy, but economics, politics, and law for centuries to come. Jeremy Bentham's version of utilitarianism was brutally simple. He believed that pleasure and pain are the only things that matter. Good equals pleasure, bad equals pain. Everything else, whether it's money, friendship, freedom, or knowledge, only matters because it leads to pleasure or prevents pain. This view is called hedonism, and Bentham took it seriously. He even invented something called the hedonic calculus, which was essentially a mathematical formula for measuring happiness. You'd consider the intensity of the pleasure, how long it lasts, how certain you are it will happen, how soon it will occur, and so on. Add it all up and you'd know which action produces the most happiness. To Bentham, all pleasures were equal. The pleasure you get from reading Shakespeare wasn't any more valuable than the pleasure you get from eating pizza. Pleasure is pleasure. This approach had a real strength. It was clear, simple, and democratic. It didn't matter who you were, rich or poor, king or peasant. Your happiness counted the same as everyone else's. But it also had a glaring weakness. It was cold and mechanical. It treated human beings like happiness machines, and it completely ignored things like justice, rights, and human dignity. If torturing one innocent person would somehow make 1,000 people slightly happier, Bentham's system would say go ahead and do it. That's a problem. John Stuart Mill saw these problems and tried to fix them. He agreed with Bentham's basic idea that maximizing happiness was the goal of morality, but he thought Bentham's version was too crude. Mill introduced a crucial distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Lower pleasures were physical things like eating, drinking, and other bodily sensations. Higher pleasures were intellectual and moral things like reading, learning, creating art, and forming deep relationships. Mill famously said it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, and better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. What he meant was that even if a pig experiences constant physical pleasure, its life isn't as valuable as a human's life filled with complex thoughts and emotions, even if that human suffers sometimes. Mill wanted to preserve human dignity within utilitarianism. He wanted to say that some kinds of happiness matter more than others. But here's the thing, he was still committed to the same basic goal as Bentham, maximizing happiness for the majority. Once you understand the basic principle, you realize there are different ways to apply it. This leads to two major versions of utilitarianism: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says that each individual action should be judged by whether it maximizes happiness right now, in this specific situation. There are no fixed rules. Every time you face a moral choice, you calculate which option will produce the most overall happiness, and you do that. This approach is flexible and practical. It means lying can be moral if it makes people happier. Stealing can be moral if it redistributes wealth in a way that increases overall well-being. Even killing can be moral if it saves more lives than it takes. Think about it this way. Imagine you promise to meet your friend for lunch, but on your way you see someone else who needs help, and helping them would create slightly more happiness than keeping your promise. Act utilitarianism says break your promise. But if everyone thought this way, promises would become meaningless. Nobody could trust anyone's word. The world would become chaotic because you could never predict how people would behave. This is where act utilitarianism starts to unravel. It optimizes for immediate results, but destroys the social trust that makes cooperation possible in the first place. Rule utilitarianism was developed specifically to solve these problems. Instead of judging each action individually, rule utilitarians say we should follow rules that, if everyone followed them, would lead to the greatest happiness. For example, a rule like always tell the truth, or always keep your promises, or don't kill innocent people. These rules provide moral stability. They tell us how to act even when we can't calculate all the consequences, and they protect people from short-term harm done in the name of long-term good. The idea is that society functions better when people follow consistent moral rules, even if occasionally breaking a rule might produce slightly better results in an individual case. The driving example often used to explain rule utilitarianism is traffic rules. Imagine if every driver had to calculate at every moment whether stopping at a red light would maximize utility. You'd have to consider whether other cars are coming, whether anyone might get hurt, whether you're in a hurry, and on and on. Sometimes you stop at a red light even when no other cars are around, which wastes a bit of time and fuel. But overall, having everyone follow this rule saves far more lives than allowing everyone to make individual judgments. Rule utilitarianism applies this same logic to moral rules. Yes, occasionally following a rule might produce slightly less happiness than breaking it. But society as a whole is better off when people follow consistent rules that everyone can trust. Here's the catch though. If following a rule clearly produces less happiness than breaking it, what should you do? If you're a true utilitarian, your ultimate goal is still maximizing happiness, right? So shouldn't you break the rule? This is the trap that rule utilitarianism falls into. Critics argue that rule utilitarianism either collapses back into act utilitarianism when it matters most, or it becomes a form of rule worship where you follow rules even when breaking them would clearly produce better results. Either way, there's a logical problem at the heart of the theory. Both versions of utilitarianism face a fundamental problem. How do you actually measure happiness? Can you really compare one person's suffering to another person's joy and add them up like numbers on a spreadsheet? Whose happiness counts more, the majorities or the minorities? What about long-term versus short-term consequences? What if an action creates happiness now but causes suffering later, or vice versa? These aren't just theoretical questions, they're practical problems that make utilitarianism almost impossible to apply in real life. You can't put happiness on a scale, you can't calculate it with mathematical precision, and yet utilitarianism assumes you can. This measurement problem has haunted the theory since Bentham first proposed his hedonic calculus, and no one has solved it yet. But the measurement problem isn't even the worst issue. The real nightmare scenario for utilitarianism is what happens when maximizing happiness conflicts with justice and human rights. Here's a classic example. Imagine there's been a horrible crime, and an angry mob is demanding justice. The police know the real culprit escaped, but they also know the mob is about to riot, which will result in many deaths and massive destruction. A judge realizes that if he convicts and punishes an innocent person, the mob will be satisfied, and all those deaths will be prevented. According to utilitarian logic, the judge should punish the innocent person. One person suffers unjustly, but hundreds or thousands of people are saved. The math checks out. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. But doesn't this seem horribly wrong? Or consider this medical scenario. A doctor has 5 patients who will die without organ transplants. A healthy person comes in for a routine checkup. The doctor realizes this healthy person is a perfect match for all 5 patients. If the doctor kills this one person and harvests their organs, 5 people will live, 1 death versus 5 deaths. Shouldn't the doctor do it? Utilitarianism seems to say yes, but most people would call this murder. This is the justice and rights problem, and it reveals something deeply troubling about utilitarian thinking. It treats individuals as tools for collective happiness. It can justify cruelty if it's efficient. It can sacrifice the innocent for the greater good. And once you start down that road, where do you stop? Over the years, philosophers have tried to patch up utilitarianism with various modifications. Some introduce preference utilitarianism, which focuses on satisfying people's preferences rather than just maximizing pleasure. The philosopher Peter Singer is famous for this approach. Others propose negative utilitarianism, which says we should focus on reducing suffering rather than increasing happiness. The idea is that preventing pain might be more important than creating pleasure. Then there's two-level utilitarianism, which says we should use simple moral rules for everyday decisions but apply act utilitarianism in special or extreme cases. Each modification tries to fix the contradictions and weaknesses in classical utilitarianism, but each one creates its own new problems and complexities. The more you try to patch the theory, the more complicated and less practical it becomes. Despite all these problems, utilitarianism hasn't gone away. In fact, it's more influential than ever in modern society. When governments use cost-benefit analysis to decide which policies to pursue, that's utilitarian thinking. When hospitals decide how to allocate scarce medical resources during a crisis, that's medical triage, based on utilitarian principles. When economists talk about maximizing social welfare, they're using utilitarian logic. Even debates about artificial intelligence ethics often come down to utilitarian calculations about how to program machines to make decisions that maximize overall well-being. The language of the greatest good for the greatest number is everywhere in modern policy and ethics, but this raises a new ethical risk. Who gets to decide what counts as good? Who gets to weigh the costs and benefits? What happens when the people doing the calculations don't share your values or priorities? Let's be fair though, utilitarianism has real strengths, and that's why it's persisted for over 2 centuries. It's simple and intuitive. Everyone wants to be happy and avoid suffering. So basing morality on happiness makes immediate sense. It focuses on outcomes rather than intentions, which means you can't justify bad results by claiming you meant well. It promotes impartiality because it says everyone's happiness counts equally, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. And it encourages rational thinking about ethics. Instead of blindly following tradition or authority, utilitarianism asks us to think about consequences and make reasoned moral judgments. These are genuine virtues, and they explain why so many smart, well-intentioned people have been attracted to utilitarian thinking. But the weaknesses are equally real and equally serious. Utilitarianism is too demanding. It expects constant moral calculation, always weighing options and measuring outcomes. It turns every decision into a math problem. It also completely ignores intentions and character. In utilitarian thinking, it doesn't matter whether you're a good person trying your best or a selfish monster pursuing your own interests. All that matters is the outcome. A serial killer who accidentally saves a life has done something more moral than a kind person whose good intentions lead to bad results. That seems backwards. Most fundamentally, utilitarianism can justify injustice and cruelty in the name of the greater good. It reduces human life to statistics. Happiness points to be maximized like a video game score. It loses sight of the fact that behind every number is a real person with dignity, rights, and inherent worth. The legacy of utilitarianism is complicated. It shaped modern democracy, influenced legal systems, guided economic policy, and contributed to the development of human rights. In some ways, we're all utilitarians now. We all believe that consequences matter, that reducing suffering is good, and that morality should make the world a better place. But utilitarianism as a complete moral theory has serious, perhaps fatal problems. It forces us to confront uncomfortable moral trade-offs that we'd prefer to ignore. It asks us to put numbers on things that seem beyond measurement. And it suggests that under the right circumstances, anything, even murder, could be justified. The debate over utilitarianism isn't just an academic exercise. It's about how we decide what kind of society we want to live in and what we're willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of the greater good. So let's return to where we started, the theory that can justify murder. Utilitarianism began as a hopeful dream, a vision of a rational, fair morality that would replace superstition and arbitrary rules with clear principles based on human well-being. Bentham and Mill genuinely believed they were creating a better world, one where everyone's happiness mattered equally, and where suffering could be systematically reduced. But as we've seen, the same logic that seeks happiness for all can excuse suffering for some. The same principle that says save 5 lives instead of 1 can be twisted to justify punishing the innocent, violating human rights, and treating people as mere resources to be optimized. Reason alone cannot save us from our own calculations. The numbers don't lie, but they also don't tell the whole truth. Moral progress may not lie in abandoning utilitarian thinking entirely. We need to consider consequences, we need to reduce suffering, and we need to think rationally about ethics. But we also need to remember the human faces behind the numbers, the individual lives that can't be reduced to data points in someone else's equation. Because once you forget that, once you start treating people as means rather than ends, you're not calculating the greatest good anymore. You're just justifying harm. And that's when a theory designed to create happiness becomes the very thing that can justify murder.